Good morning, 8th graders. Thanks for tuning in to our Week 4 History Distance Learning screencast. Um, Today we continue our unit on the American West. Thanks for completing last week's Lesson 3 activity titled American West Lewis and Clark Expedition. And in a moment we'll begin a look at our Week 4 unit topic. However, before we get there, make sure that you're referring to each week's distance learning weekly folder in Schoology. In each weekly folder, you will find a unit topic, and we break down that unit topic two ways. One is the screencast, which you're listening to right now, and the other will be a unit topic activity based on the screencast. So you watch the screencast, that's an easy 10 points. Everyone gets credit for watching the screencast. Not much to do except to listen. And then you complete the activity. And those are the two things contained in the weekly distance learning lesson folder. And then you come to our Friday Zoom class, and we go ahead and we go over the screencast, and we go over the guiding questions that are embedded in the screencast that we'll get to in a moment. So that's kind of the progression each week. So let's move on to our Week 4 topic. And our Week 4 topic, covering our unit on the American West, is the Mexican-American War. So a quick review. So far we've looked at the Louisiana Purchase, and then we looked at the Lewis and Clark Expedition, and today we're going to look at the Mexican-American War. For those of you that have Mexican background, this is a topic that will enable you to kind of get a good understanding of your identity as an American. And you know, the Mexican-American War really laid the foundation for Mexican-American relationships since then. Some of it's been positive, some of it not so positive. Obviously, war is never a positive event, but as we look at this topic this week, we want to think of a couple things. One is, you know, our question for the unit is, you know, how did America expand west? And we've already looked at two examples of that. Here's a third example, the Mexican-American War. And then more specifically for this particular screencast, why are wars fought? Okay, are wars fought for economic reasons? Are wars fought for political reasons? Are wars fought for religious, cultural, or geographic reasons? We will go ahead and use those as anchor questions throughout this screencast. So let's move on. Okay, so here is our topic starter question. For what reasons are wars fought? So go ahead and take a moment and think of some reasons that you might think wars are fought for. You might want to remind yourself of a few examples of wars that have been fought. You know, we just in the past 20 years, America's fought a war against Iraq. We fought a war against Afghanistan. Before that, we had wars against Vietnam, World War I, World War II, of course, Korea, the Civil War, the Revolutionary War, which we've also talked about in this class. So take a moment to think about why wars are fought. Ready, go. Okay. When we get to our Zoom class on Friday, we can go ahead and share those topics. Here we go. Okay, the Mexican-American War. Here's perhaps some. Well, this is we kind of already covered this, but we'll cover it again. The Mexican-American War. Why are wars fought? What is the purpose of war? Is it to gain economic power? Is it to gain political power? To defend against invaders? Maybe all of the above. Purpose of war regarding the Mexican-American War. Okay, so why did we fight? Now that we've examined why wars are fought and you have brainstormed some ideas, let's go ahead and begin our look at the Mexican-American War, and let's see if we can line up any of those reasons why this war was fought. So during the 1800s, Mexico owned most of the land between the Rocky Mountains and the Pacific Ocean, and the U.S. wanted that land for political and economic and religious reasons. So if you guys remember, we bought the Louisiana Purchase, which stretched from the Mississippi to the Rocky Mountains. However, in the mid 1800s, Mexico pretty much controlled all the North American land from the Rocky Mountains to the Pacific. So, if America wanted to extend its nation from the Rocky Mountains to the Pacific, it would have to negotiate with Mexico somehow. And what turned out happening was the two sides went to war. Okay, so why did this war happen? Well, political reasons drove the war, economic reasons drove the war, and finally, religious reasons also were one of the causes of this war. Moving on. All right, so as America moved west, you guys, the fight between Mexico and the USA really began in the Southwest, which is in a state which is today the state of Texas. Okay, back then in the 1830s, Texas was part of Mexico. It was called Tejas. Okay, the Mexican pronunciation for Texas. So Tejas was part of Mexico. Americans began moving into Texas, and the Mexican government allowed them to stay. They allowed them to stay for some if they agreed to several requirements. One was that they had to give up their American citizenship and become Mexicans. Two, they had to give up slaves. Okay, if they were Americans that were bringing African slaves into Texas, that was not allowed under Mexican law, so the Mexicans asked them to give up their slaves. And finally, they had to become Catholic Christians. Okay, so a lot of Americans in the mid-1800s were Protestant Christians, and in order to live in Texas as part of Mexico, you had to become Catholic. So three things if Americans wanted to live in Texas: give up their slaves, become a Mexican citizen, and adopt the Catholic religion. Okay, so there are many hundreds of Americans that moved into Texas and agreed to those terms. However, over time, more and more people started flooding into Texas, and as more white Americans began flooding into Texas, those three requirements became, people didn't want to follow those three requirements. The most common one that was broken was the slaves. Okay, a lot of white Americans were moving from the southern states into Tejas or Texas, and they were bringing slaves that angered the Mexican government. The Mexican government actually got so angry at one point that they invaded Tejas to push the Americans out, and the American settlers in Texas went to war against the Mexican government. And remember, Texas. The Americans living in Texas were not part of the USA. Texas was not part of the USA. This was part of Mexico. So when they brought their slaves in and violated the agreement they had with the Mexican government actually went to war against these Americans. And the Americans, led by a gentleman named Sam Houston, won a war against the Mexicans. And Texas became an independent nation. So how did the Mexican-American War begin? Well, it began a few years later when America decided to add Texas to the United States as a state. After Texas fought for independence against Mexico, it became an independent nation until the USA decided to add it as a state. When it was added as a state, when it was added as a state, the borders, the southern borders of what would become the state of Texas, they were not agreed upon by both the United States and Texas. So Texas was going to become part of the United States, and the southern border of Texas was going to become the border with Mexico. Now the Mexicans said, "Oh no, the state of Texas that you are claiming is smaller than you actually think it is," and the Americans said, "No, Texas is actually bigger." And the disputed land really rested on these two rivers right here. These two rivers: the Rio Grande to the south, and this river right here further north. Okay, now the Mexicans, in order to get more land, they claimed that this river was going to be the southern border of Texas. The Americans, who wanted Texas to be bigger and to have more American land, they claimed the Rio Grande was the southern border of Texas. So they did not agree. Okay, so when the USA added Texas as a state, it sparked a disagreement over the border between the two countries, with each wanting more land. So it was a fight over the state of Texas that led to the beginning of the Mexican-American War. All right, so what happened was the Mexican army killed American soldiers. When the USA sent soldiers into Texas to take control of the disputed land, a fight broke out when the Mexican army fired first, killing 51 Americans. Okay, so you have a land dispute going on. The Americans think that one river is the border. The Mexicans think another river is the border. So the Americans send troops into the land that they think belongs to them. This provokes the Mexican army. The Mexican army sent troops into the land that they thought belonged to them. And when the two armies confronted each other, the Mexican army opened fire, killing 51 Americans. Okay, that's kind of how wars might begin. Okay, so one of our questions was, how do wars begin? For what reasons are wars fought? Well, killing 50, if the Mexican army kills 51 American soldiers, who sent the army in there? Who does the army work for, and whose decision was it to send soldiers into disputed land? And that decision can be traced back to governments, both the government on the Mexican side, the government on the American side. So those are political decisions. When you send armies into disputed land and they confront each other, those armies are acting on behalf of governments. So this war certainly began for political reasons, because when 51 Americans were killed, the U.S. Congress decided to declare war on Mexico, claiming the Mexican army had shed American blood on American soil. Congress quickly declared war in 1848 to avenge American deaths, and thus began the Mexican-American War. Okay, so it was based on the deaths of those Americans, and that is a political reason. So here's our first discussion question. What political reasons led to the Mexican-American War? We just outlined them over the last 4 or 5 minutes, so go ahead and take a moment and remind yourself of what those reasons were. Ready, go. Okay, good. So we learned that, what political reasons led to the Mexican-American War. Well, the decision for the American government to send soldiers into disputed land, and the decision for the Mexican government to do the same. And when Mexicans killed Americans, that triggered the federal Congress to declare war on Mexico. So that is a political reason. Here we go. Okay, however, there was more to declaring war against Mexico than just politics. All right. If you remember from the beginning of the screencast, we mentioned that the Louisiana Purchase stretched from the Mississippi to the Rocky Mountains, and Mexico controlled all North American land from the Rocky Mountains to the Pacific. And if the USA wanted that land from the Rocky Mountains to the Pacific, they would have to go through Mexico. So if you look at this map right here, you will see in the 1840s, Mexico controlled a huge chunk of what is today the United States. And by declaring war in Mexico over Texas, this area down here, they had the chance, if they won the war, to force the Mexican government to surrender all this land that you see on the map. So another decision to declare war was economic. Okay, what would they gain if they defeated Mexico? They would gain land. Okay, and we know the value of land. We've discussed the value of land pretty in depth in this class. And land is, the use of land, would that be valuable economically? And the answer is probably yes. Okay, we know the value of land, and land is an economic resource. So American President Polk wanted Mexican land in the West, see the map, and if the U.S. won a war against Mexico, they could force the Mexicans to surrender this land. So not only was it the killing of the 51 Americans in Texas that triggered war, it was also the desire to go to war against Mexico in the hopes of defeating Mexico and getting all this Western land. that would add a great economic benefit to the United States. So back to our question, for what reasons are wars fought? Are wars fought for political reasons? Check, we just learned that. Are wars fought for economic reasons? Check. Americans wanted land. Okay, so here we go. New land equals economic wealth. By the 1840s, Americans wanted more land in the West for economic opportunity and wealth, and through war with Mexico, they could win it. So there's another reason why wars are fought, and this one happens to be economic. All right, so here's our next question. What economic reasons led to the Mexican-American War? We just covered them in the last 3 or 4 minutes. If you need to scroll back on the screencast to get a review of what those reasons were, go ahead and take a moment now to answer our discussion question number 2. Okay, so hopefully you guys were all successfully able to answer that. What economic reasons led to the Mexican-American War? And if you answered the desire for more Western land to gain economic value, the answer is correct. Okay, so now we have 2 reasons why the Mexican-American War was fought. Moving on. All right. Now, as Americans moved west, we learned that when we bought the Louisiana Purchase, it was inhabited by natives. When the Lewis and Clark expedition went up the Missouri River and down the Columbia, they met many natives. You know, and the thinking was, okay, well, you know, is this land could this land potentially belong to Americans, or does it belong to natives? And the Americans had a unique perspective on this. And you know, this was a perspective that drove American decision making as they moved west, and that was that, you know, hey, we are experimenting in this grand experiment called democracy, which was created when Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence, and you know, Native Americans are not engaged in this experiment, Mexicans are not engaged in this experiment. And it must have been, you know, God that chose the Americans to engage in this great experiment of democracy that they gave us in 1776. And then God granted us the ability to win the Revolutionary War. And now it's God that's granting us the ability to move west, to take land from the natives and go to war against the Mexicans and take land from the Mexicans. And so this idea that it was God's choice to give the North American continent to the Americans to extend this great American experiment in democracy was really the way the Americans thought in the 1840s. Now there's a term for this, and it's called manifest destiny, and that is our topic for our next screencast. Okay, so the great experiment in democracy, as the USA moved west, they justified fighting for land by using Christian religious beliefs, saying that Americans were chosen by God to expand the great experiment of American democracy across the continent. So who gave Americans the freedom to expand across the continent? In their mind, God gave them the freedom to do that. So the Mexican-American War and the desire to take on the Mexicans and fight the Mexicans and potentially beat them and take their land could also be, you could also argue that it was done for religious reasons. Okay, so that is another third reason why wars might be fought, specifically the Mexican-American War. Americans believe that God wanted them to have the land to extend American democracy across the continent. So here we go. Brings us to our discussion question number 3. What religious reasons led to the Mexican-American War? Well, this belief called manifest destiny, which said that, you know, the Americans have been chosen to take the North American continent because they are extending freedom, democracy, rights, and opportunity across the continent. Okay, so take a moment and let's remind ourselves what religious reasons led to the Mexican-American War. If you need a moment to go back on the screencast to review the discussion, go ahead and try to answer this question now. Ready, go. Okay, moving on. All right, so now let's talk about the war itself. The war lasted 3 years, the Mexican-American War did. With battles from California to Mexico City, the war lasted 3 years and ended when Mexico City was conquered and the Mexican government surrendered. So the war really, it took place. Some of the battles were in Southern California, some of the battles were in Northern California. It was during the Mexican-American War where the Bear Flag Rebellion took place, which is a topic we talk about when we get to the Gold Rush. And finally, but what really happened was the American army began pushing the Mexicans deeper and deeper into Mexico until finally they got to the ancient Aztec capital of Mexico City, which was controlled by the Spanish, and then during the war it was controlled, of course, by the Mexicans, and the U.S. Marines conquered Mexico City and forced Mexico to surrender after 3 years of war. Okay, now that led to some serious negotiation over land. Remember, we talked about the desire of the Americans as they moved west to take more land, and one of the reasons they wanted to go to war against Mexico was to get land. So once Mexico was conquered and they were forced to surrender, what happened? Here we go. So the war ended with a treaty. Now, treaties are usually the way wars end. You sit down, you write out a contract or some sort of agreement, and you say one side won, one side lost, and they negotiate what's going to happen as a result of the war ending. Okay, and usually the victor, the winner gets to demand stuff of the loser. Okay, so in this case, we know that the prize was for the Americans was land. So under the surrender treaty called the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, Mexico is forced to surrender land that now makes up all or part of 8 U.S. states. So you can see the map here. This was called the Mexican Cession. Okay, the Mexican Cession was the land that the Mexicans gave up as a result of the Mexican-American War in 1848. So you can see here that the USA got all of California, Nevada, Utah, Arkansas, parts of New Mexico, parts of Colorado, parts of Wyoming. Gigantic chunk of land. And you also see down here that the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo pretty much they created the borders, the southern borders between Mexico and the United States as they exist today. There was one more land deal called the Gadsden Purchase, which gave Americans a little more land. But essentially the border is almost identical to the one that was agreed upon under the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848. Okay, moving on. After the war, okay, so with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, the USA now stretched from the Atlantic all the way to the Pacific Ocean, and from Canada to today's border with Mexico. So this little chunk of Mexico right here was later purchased from Mexico, which also became the United States. So now, you guys, in 1848, we see pretty much our borders as they exist today. The 13 original colonies pushed into the Ohio River Valley, and then the Louisiana Purchase, which gave us all this, and then the Mexican-American War, which gave us most of the land in the West. And so this war resulted in America achieving its goal of pretty much expanding all the way to the Pacific. Moving on. Okay, so now let's look at our starter question from the beginning of the screencast. We asked, for what reasons are wars fought? And using the Mexican-American War as an example, we identified political reasons, we identified economic reasons, and finally we identified religious reasons that lead to wars. Okay, so big universal guiding questions. So once when you examine one war and you analyze its the meaning and the causes and effects of it, you find that those causes and effects, or at least the causes, are common to many different wars. You just have to know how to identify them. All right, moving on. All right, so our week 4 activity this week is titled American West number 4, the Mexican-American War. It includes 5 parts. You're going to answer the, You're going to answer the topic starter question, and when you do the activity, you don't have to answer this on paper. You save this answer to be shared during our Zoom classroom, okay? So in the activity, you have 1, 2, 3, 4 parts. You have a topic text reading that talks about the Mexican-American War, text-based support questions, independent questions, and enrichment questions, okay? The independent and enrichment questions both give you an opportunity to do some additional research about the topic to answer. The independent question is just a short written response any way you want, and the enrichment question is a short written response written in a race-style paragraph where we restate the question, answer the question, cite evidence, and explain our answer. Okay, so this is our weekly activity, so we want to make sure you guys complete it. And then you really want it done before you get to the before you get to our Zoom class on Friday. All right. So if you want, once you click on the activity in our week 4 distance learning folder, you will see instructions for each part. Okay. So just follow the instructions. All right. Moving on. Okay, people. Thanks for watching this week's screencast on the American West, Mexican-American War. I hope all of you and your families are staying safe, and I'm looking forward to seeing you next week at our screencast. However, between now and next week, we will meet for our normal Friday Zoom classroom, so I'm looking forward to seeing all of you there, and take good care of yourself, and I will see you soon.